Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to Exploring Inclusion. We are going to talk about personas. We're going to talk about accessibility. We're going to talk about really getting to the heart of what your users need, both disabled users and abled users. So a little bit about me. My name is Jenna Charlton. I have been testing for about 10 years now. I actually work for a company called Coveros. Little bit of a shameless plug. I promise this is all you'll hear about it. We do consulting, we do agile coaching, we do DevOps coaching and DevOps and agile transformations, and we also do training. And I happen to be a trainer for Coveros. So I teach software testing courses and agile principle courses. If you're interested in consulting, if you're interested in training or doing an agile transformation or a DevOps transformation, please reach out to me. That's all I'm going to say on that. I am at She Wrestles Test on Twitter. Feel free to reach out and connect to me if you want to talk about this or want to talk about anything else. I am a deacon at my church. I am a cat mom. I have 2 furry little overlords that share my home. I love pro wrestling and punk rock, and needless to say, I'm pretty into web accessibility. So you're probably saying, well, inclusion, I kind of thought this was going to be about accessibility. And it's really about both, because at the heart of talking about accessibility is inclusion. When we're talking about making our websites and apps accessible, we're talking about including everyone and leaving none of our users behind. To get to the point where we're really creating an inclusive experience, though, where we're really being inclusive to our disabled users, we need to move from doing accessibility, which is really about remediation, and move to doing inclusive design. Inclusive design at its heart is about putting the disabled user first and thinking about the needs of a disabled user before we start thinking about our abled users. The whole purpose here being that if we design for accessibility first and we think about those users first, we're going to need to do less accessibility remediation. Accessibility becomes baked in, and it's going to cost us less in the long term because, as we know, when we address potential risks and pitfalls and defects before they get into our code base, it's much, much cheaper to fix them than if we let them move down the line. This is going to improve the experience of all of our users. When we think about the needs of our disabled users first, everybody benefits. It creates a better experience for everyone. To get to the point where we're really doing that, it helps to have a design system. Now, design systems are something your company may or may not be using. Design systems are all about creating a library that's a set of standards. It will have component-specific guidance. You may have accessible colors listed, brand-specific colors, brand-specific textiles, accessible textiles. This really gets you to a point where everybody's doing the same thing, essentially. And this gets you to a point where you don't have to worry about doing remediation for color contrast because you've thought about it before any code makes it to paper, so to speak. So this is going to create a standard, and it also creates a culture of inclusivity. And the reason it does that is because when everybody is thinking about accessibility at the design level, everybody starts to think about it as you move through the life cycle. So everyone is thinking about being inclusive. Everyone is thinking about creating something that's accessible. And for us as testers, this gives us a really, really, really early opportunity to get our hands into what's going to be built and have a say and do some static analysis. This gives us a chance to head off potential pitfalls later. Now, one of the principles of a design system is to use this principle. It's called universal design. Universal design is all about making sure that both the digital and physical world is accessible to everyone. Elise Roy, who's really kind of one of the experts on this universal design concept, says when we design for disability first, you often stumble upon solutions that are better than those when we design for the norm. And this really kind of goes to the heart of what we're talking about when we talk about universal design, when we talk about inclusive design, when we talk about accessibility. There are 7 principles of universal design, and we're not going to dig too far into the weeds on this. But I will tell you, because it's a little boring to sit here and have somebody lecture at you about the 7 principles or about WCAG, what I've done is I've just included a little bit of detail here. And at the end of this slide deck is detailed information about the 7 principles and a little bit of light information about WCAG. So I'm going to make this deck accessible to you so that you can go ahead and look through this and use it as a resource. So know that you can dig deeper, but I didn't want to like weigh you down on all that with all of this. So the 7 principles of inclusive design are equitable use, flexibility in use, simple and intuitive use, perceptible information, tolerance for error, low physical effort, and size and space for approach and use. Now these kind of are self-explanatory. They really sort of define themselves. So what I want to do is kind of link this up to what we use as our guide in the digital world, which is WCAG. And WCAG stands for the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. These are the guidelines that we use both as a standard within the industry and a standard as our legal guidance, because WCAG violations do have legal implications. So we use this as our guide. But these 7 principles align really closely with the 4 principles of WCAG. So if we look at the first principle of WCAG, which is perceivable, and by the way, we kind of shorten the 4 principles of WCAG to POUR: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So under perceivable, we have perceptible information. They kind of align straight to each other. And also I've put down here at the end of all of them equitable use, because really equitable use is the heart of WCAG and it's the heart of universal design. It's all about making sure that everybody has equal availability, accessibility, everyone can use the application, the physical product you've built equally. And this doesn't mean that we leave anyone behind, and it doesn't mean that somebody has to do extra work. It means that we've made it equitable. So perceivable, it links directly to perceptible information. Operable links directly to size and space for approach and use. It can be operated because the size and space is operable to the user, that they have enough room on their mobile device. They have enough room on their desktop window. Flexibility in use, that if somebody needs to use a different device type, that it's still operable, that it works in multiple browsers, understanding that some disabled users may opt for one browser over another because of their specific requirements or specific needs. Understandable, it takes low physical effort and it takes low emotional effort. It's not too complicated. And then of course, simple and intuitive use. And simple and intuitive use, this is really important, not just for our disabled users, by the way. This is really important for some of our left behind users. And those are people like our grandparents, who their first computer may have been their mobile phone. You know, like you gave them a phone, you said, here, grandma, here, grandpa, I want you to be able to get a hold of me. I want you to be able to get pictures of my kids by text, or be part of the family group chat. So that you gave them an iPhone or you gave them an Android. And that was their first experience with really interacting with the digital world. And now maybe they've moved on to a tablet, or maybe they've moved on to an iPad, or even they got a computer. But for them, their first experience was mobile. So our digital experience for them on desktop has to kind of mirror mobile, because that's what's intuitive for them. We have to really think about those kinds of users, especially as our population continues to age. We need to think about our seniors and our sort of left behind users that aren't disabled, but do have unique needs. And then robust, which is, I link to tolerance for error. Our applications have to be robust enough. They have to be hardy enough that when there's a user error or the application fails, that the tolerance is there and that it's not something that becomes a barrier for users. So some examples of universal design in the physical world. And I think this is important because it starts to kind of link this principle to reality. It can be hard to take these abstract concepts and make them real, but I think this really does that. So first we have ramps. Ramps, of course, were built with the intention of people who are in a wheelchair, or people who are on a walker, or using mobility scooter, or maybe on crutches, or using a cane, to be able to easily access things that are at an elevation. But as you can see from this image, and I'm sure a lot of us have done this, sometimes you opt for using a ramp over using the stairs. It can be easier. Maybe you're carrying a lot of things, so the ramp is less energy usage for you. So this just made everybody's life a little bit better to start installing ramps. Then we have things like curb cuts. Curb cuts were intended for people who are in a wheelchair who are using a mobility device to be able to get up onto the sidewalk or get off of the sidewalk. But everybody uses curb cuts now. You know, this is where we put crosswalks. This is how kids riding their bike get from the street to the sidewalk. This is just easier if it's snowing, if it's icy, like it always is where I live. You know, this just makes everybody's life a little bit simpler, but its original intention was to help people using a mobility device. And the last one, and I think this is really kind of a big one in this sort of new world that we're living in, are the switch buttons, the push buttons for people in a wheelchair or people who may otherwise struggle to open the door. I can't tell you how many times I've opted to use that button because I'm carrying a whole bunch of things. It's much easier than trying to push the door open. And of course, in this new world that we're in where we don't want to touch things, now we have a way to open a door just by using our elbow. And this is a great benefit to the abled world, but it was intended for disabled users. Its original intention was to make places that were otherwise inaccessible for someone in a wheelchair or who couldn't physically open the door on their own to be able to get into that space on their own. So let's link that then to our digital world, this new digital world that we live in. So here's some examples of universal design and how it's kind of changed our reality. So closed captions on videos that we can now watch without sound. That, of course, was intended for people who are hearing impaired or who are deaf. But for me, I will sometimes sit on the couch and just watch a video with the closed captions on. I don't want to hear the sound. I just want to see what they have to say. Bold fonts. Bold fonts were intended for people who have low vision or who have color contrast issues so that they can see those words and letters better. But it certainly makes things better for all of us because bold fonts help us improve viewing in highlight situations like sunshine or low light situations. So again, something intended for the disabled world that has made things better for everybody. And the last one are bigger targets on mobile devices. I personally have a problem with targets on my phone or targets on my tablet. I have some spatial reasoning issues that come from my learning disability. It's just kind of all wrapped up in it. So I need bigger targets because I have a hard time hitting them on my phone. I often happen to have to blow things up to be able to hit the target. But those bigger targets don't just help people like me. They also help you if you're sitting on the bus or sitting on a train or using your phone while you're walking. All of those kinds of changes make the world just better for everybody. But their intention was to make the world easier and more accessible to people with a disability. So some benefits of universal design and inclusive design. All of our users benefit when we're thinking about disability first, when we're building for disability first. There's less rework if we're thinking about inclusion and if we're thinking about our disabled users before we really start building our application. And of course, less rework means less cost, means getting our work through faster, means meeting our goals better. And we're reducing the risk. Not making your applications accessible to disabled users not only loses you customers, because disabled users are customers. They're out there spending money just like everybody else is, but it also reduces the risk of your legal liabilities. So what does this mean to us as testers? Well, this means we can test earlier. We can do things like static analysis on our design system. We can do static analysis on wireframes. We can look at our requirements and really think critically about whether something is going to be an accessibility issue. So we can really shift left and really start testing earlier. We can identify potential risks. Being able to test earlier helps us do risk identification earlier. The earlier we identify our risks, the more we're able to mitigate them, the more safely we're able to go to production. We can enforce compliance for our systems, both compliance to WCAG, which is a legal standard, and compliance to your brand identity and your brand standards. And this really gives us a chance to influence. If we're at the table when we're talking about design systems, if we're at the table when we're talking about what our application is really going to look like from a requirement standpoint, from look and feel and use, we're able to influence building accessible software. So this really gives us a chance to have a voice in the application, and it's a really good opportunity to really speak up and make a change. So I want to shift, because this talk is kind of in two parts. So we've talked about these principles of design, we've talked about what it means to make your application accessible. But let's go to the other side of this. Let's talk about our users. I want to give a caveat. Nothing that we can do as abled or people who have a not real limiting disability, nothing that we will do will top having a conversation with our disabled users and including them in the conversation when we're looking to do things for them. I want to put that out there, and I want to make that very clear. Nothing we do should be done without their voice in the conversation. And we're going to talk about this quite a few times. So let's start with personas. Let's start with what a persona is and what a persona really isn't. So a persona is a representative of a person. It's Sally salesperson. It's Eunice user. You know, we've given them kind of silly names in the testing world over the years, but it's representative of a person, but it's not an actual person. So when we're talking about personas for disability, we're not saying that we've taken one person and looked at them and looked at their life and built a persona for them. That's not what we want to do, because every person is unique. So instead, we're going to generalize our personas by a population. We're going to look at blind users as a population. We're going to get the majority of folks, what their needs are, and we're going to use that to help us build a persona that's meaningful for that kind of user. And it's organized by disability or by role. So a lot of us have probably used personas in the past for other kinds of testing. So you could have done role-based testing. So you have users, admins, super users, things like that. And using a persona in the realm of accessibility isn't that much different. But it is important to note that we're organizing it by disability, or we're organizing it by a specific type of need. So blind users, deaf users, users who have a mobility need, that have a mobility limitation, maybe users that are on the spectrum, so they have sensory processing needs. All of those different things are the ways we're going to organize our disability-based personas. So creating meaningful personas, because I've seen a lot of personas out there that aren't meaningful. They're too general. They don't actually get to the heart of what our user needs in our application. Or they're so general that they're meant for everybody to be able to go out and use them. But because your application is unique, as every application is, it doesn't actually get to the heart of what you need to be testing. So creating a meaningful persona requires observation. And when I say observation, this means that when you're looking to create personas, you may want to do an initial accessibility lab to bring in disabled users and ask them to use what you have so far. Observe the way they use your application. Look at where their trouble spots are and start building personas based around that. It requires a deep understanding of a user's need and sometimes of disability. And this is where the conversations come in with disabled users. And it requires a deep understanding of users in general. So not just disabled users, but all users. You really need to understand who your user is and who your audience is before sitting down to create personas. And again, this idea of having the conversation with disabled users, there's a phrase that you hear a lot in the disabled community, which is nothing for us without us. You never want to build something with the intention of it being released to disabled users or for a disabled community and not include them in the conversation and not include them in the design and not include them in the use. I want to give a really, really good example of this. And this example is from Microsoft. I don't know if you saw around Christmas, they released a commercial for their new controller. Their new controller is intended for disabled users. You may have seen it. There's a little boy running down the street going, hey, he's going to do it. He's going to do it. He's going to do it. And he's grabbing all the neighborhood kids and they're running behind him and they go to this little boy's house and he's there using this big controller and he's beating a video game. And I'm not going to lie, that commercial makes me cry every time I see it. So I don't include it in talks because it makes me cry. but they included the disabled community when they built this controller. And then they went one step further and they said, hey, we need to be able to get these to you. So tell us what the box needs to look and feel like. Tell us how you're going to be able to open this. Help us build this so it works for you. So this box that holds this special controller that Microsoft builds, it was a collaboration. There is nowhere on this box that you need a tool or you need hands to be able to open it. Everything can be opened with a hand, with a foot, with a mouth. It's big handles, big pieces, everything slides out, nothing requires a tool. So I just want you to watch this unboxing and kind of see all of the different ways that you would be able to open this. So as you can see, this is just a really, really good example of including your user, including the specific user this is for in the conversation of how it needs to be built. This goes right along with Agile principles of making sure that you have your voice of the customer. And in this case, the voice of the customer was this very specific customer base. But it really, really is a great example of nothing for us without us. So I want to go a little bit more into personas. And I want to talk about this gentleman. His name is Todd. Todd is quadriplegic. I'm going to show you a video. And I want you to put in your mind what you think the experience is, what you think the user level is, who you think this customer is that's quadriplegic, that's using a mobile device. Now, you may already know how this works. You may have seen something like this before. And if you have, great. I apologize for showing you something you've seen. But if you haven't, I really want you to get this picture in your mind. And I want to do this because it really challenges some of your notions. I will say that Todd is going to be using what's called a switch. You saw the physical world's example of a switch in the push button to open a door. This is more of the digital version of a switch. So let's just go ahead and watch. Todd is speaking at an event for Apple. So I really hope, I wish that we were together in person because I would love to talk about this. But I really hope that that gave you an idea of how Todd uses his digital device and what it really means to think about this particular type of user if you're sitting down to build a persona. I will tell you, when I first started learning about disability a couple of years ago, and I first really started learning about accessibility and doing this kind of accessibility testing, I knew what a switch device was. I had seen physical devices that are switches. I'd seen foot pedals. I'd seen alternative mice, but I'd never really seen a user interact with it in this way. So Todd really changed the way I thought about the switch mode on a mobile device, the way I thought about switch mode on an Apple device, the way I thought about it on Android, and it changed some of my perceptions. Um, It's not that I didn't expect him to be a power user, it's just that I didn't expect him to use it in quite this way. So I learned a lot from this video, and I really hope that you got something out of it as well. Um, it's okay to sometimes have some preconceived notions and have expectations, as long as we're willing to change them based on new learnings. And this is why spending time with disabled users, spending time learning from them, asking what they need, asking how to build something that works for them is so, so important. It's so important that they be in the conversation. If you have some thoughts on this, feel free to tweet at me about it. I love this video. I think Todd's super cool. He does all sorts of things for other folks who have the same disability he does, building accessible houses. Very neat stuff. So anyway, I want to make one more shift. And I want to talk about how we take all of this stuff that I've talked about. Take the idea of accessibility, inclusive design, universal design, take personas and make it meaningful from a test perspective. In my opinion, the best way to do persona-based testing is to use a charter. Now, I will say that I love charter-based testing in general. I think exploratory testing is neato. It's just kind of the way I like to test. But I really, really love it in this case. And the reason is because it forces you to do experiential-based testing and forces you to get into the shoes of your customer for just a little bit. So when we use a persona to build a charter, we can go ahead and say, okay, I'm going to run this charter as a blind user. I'm going to look only at the non-functional things, so only at the accessibility stuff. If I find a defect that happens to be an application defect, I'm going to write it down, put it aside, deal with it later. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off my monitor, I'm going to turn on a screen reader, I'll put away my mouse, and I'm going to run this whole persona or this whole charter using this persona. So I'm going to utilize the tools of the user, and I'm really going to get into the weeds and start testing. Now, this does not replace doing an accessibility lab. You should still be doing accessibility labs, even if you're doing this kind of testing. But this is a great way to head off some really easy defects before you get to the lab. So this is a way to make sure that things are at least accessible to a screen reader or can be used by a user that's deaf if you have audio instructions, or can be used with a switch before you bring in disabled users and kind of waste their time. So this is a great way to get into their shoes, spend some time doing some testing, put all the pieces together. And now I want to put all of the pieces from today together. So let's talk about just kind of the key things and give you a little to go on to move forward. So inclusive design tops accessibility. We want to think about disability first. We don't want to make them an afterthought. We don't want to do remediation. We want to be building accessible applications from the start. Universal design is what helps us get to that point. Using universal design, we're able to apply those principles, combine them with the principles of WCAG, and really build accessible software. Design systems help our teams do their work better. We know upfront that things are accessible. We've talked about colors, we've talked about fonts, we've talked about how to build our components, we've talked about making our buttons actually buttons and not links designed to look like buttons. Those design systems really keep us focused on the way the organization wants something built and the way that it would be accessible. Nothing for us without us. Do not build something for the disabled community without including them in the conversation. Do not assume what they need. Don't assume what will work and what won't work. Include them in the conversation. Do labs, spend time with them, learning about who they are before you start building those personas. And then of course, build personas, use them for testing, use them for doing requirements, use them at all stages of your life cycle to make sure that you've really been inclusive. All of that being said, there are a couple of extra slides at the end of this deck. Those are for you to use if you want to learn more about the principles of universal design, or if you want to see the principles of WCAG. I didn't break WCAG all the way down, but if you do want to know more about that, go to W3C. WCAG is all broken down there for you. And I hope that you enjoyed this. Feel free to reach out to me with questions. Thank you so much for tuning in.